Few problems have had a more interesting trajectory through the whole history of human thought as that of the problem of mind and its place in nature. Now, this is not a problem we think of every day, but I assure you it was pondered very, very seriously by most of the great thinkers of at least the past 2 centuries. And there have been various kinds of solutions to it, but I would like to first make sure that I get across to you the problem, because that's the first big point I want to get across. It used to be called the mind-body problem, with its ponderous solutions of interactionism and epiphenomenalism and parallelism and so on. But since 1859, in the theory of evolution, it became the problem of the origin of consciousness. Now, I want to point out what this problem was to Darwin and Wallace, who were the 2 people who brought to pass the theory of natural selection, which made the theory of evolution very, very reasonable. It is that in evolution, our anatomy, all different species, the way we're shaped and what we do and all of that can be beautifully explained on the basis of natural selection. But how about all this that happens in our heads, as we call it, in our consciousness, all our dreams and hopes and imaginations and regrets and all that? How could that have been evolved through natural selection in animal behavior? And that was the real problem for both Darwin and Wallace in 1859. Darwin, I don't think, was a very good psychologist. He, in the last paragraph of The Origin of Species, sloughed it off and said, well, they're probably, back in protoplasm, there's probably mind and body, and they both evolved together. And he set out on a program of research of trying to show how there was an evolution of mind that paralleled the evolution of the body. And that really didn't work very well. Alfred Russel Wallace, whom I have a soft spot for because he is not as well known, and he thought and thought about the problem and came to the conclusion, absolutely not. All of this that goes on in our head could not have evolved through natural selection. It had to be imposed on the evolutionary string of things by God. And because of that, he then became religious and ruined his scientific reputation by attending, not because he was religious, but because he attended all these very ridiculous spiritualist sessions, seeking some kind of evidence for the imposition of God into human history and human affairs, which didn't work. There have been other solutions all along the way. One solution was, it became something called neorealism, and it is having a fashion again among physicists, namely that there's really no distinction between matter and our mental perceptions. They all can be shown to be on a continuity. And I'm sorry that that's coming up again. People like Alfred North Whitehead were indeed very involved in this. But I don't think that that really makes terribly sense. Another physicist, Eugene Wigner, that a lot of you know about, he is also sort of in that school. But there were other ideas of this that were much more important. And one was that consciousness comes in when we have learning. I'm going to be dealing with that in a moment to show you that learning really has nothing to do with it. It really comes from British empiricism and John Locke, which said that indeed if you have, we have 2 things happening in the world at once that are contiguous, then we get the association of ideas in consciousness. And therefore, if you could find the association of ideas or learning in primitive animals, that showed they had to have a mind in which there were ideas that could be associated, therefore they had consciousness. After so much psychology, we know that that whole kind of approach is, I think, wrong, without going into it in too much detail. There are other solutions along the way, such as one rather depressing solution of helpless spectator, of T.H. Huxley, that consciousness is nothing more than the smoke going behind the train. And the smoke doesn't determine where the train goes. The tracks have already decided that a long time ago. Well, if that's so, it's odd that consciousness seems to have so much to do with what we are going to do in planning out. It doesn't work. And there were other kinds of solutions. One called emergent evolution, which is having another fashion with Roger Sperry, I'm afraid now, which is very mystical. It doesn't say very much. It just says when you get the juxtaposition of, let's say, parts of the brain or something like that, then consciousness emerges. Well, I don't think that explains it either. I think that indeed we have to look somewhat more deeply and exactly about consciousness, and we've got to first find out just what is consciousness in order to proceed toward any kind of a solution to this question. Well, if I were to ask you, what is consciousness? I think most of you would sort of think, well, awareness, or perception, or something of that sort, and not be satisfied with that at all, and nor would I be. I think we first have to start off and try to say what something is not. When we have something as difficult as consciousness to try to define, we should first try to cut it off from what it isn't. Now, the first thing that consciousness is not, it's not all that's going on in your minds right now, whatever that could mean. It is not all perception. If you think it's perception, you can go back to and think of protozoa and think of your white cells that are going around in your blood right now, and they perceive bacteria. And that would mean, if that is consciousness, that then you have something like 10,000 conscious beings swirling around in your bloodstream right now, and everybody here in this audience. And I think that's a little far-fetched. I think we can dismiss that. And there are lots of other things that consciousness is not. It's just not as extensive as we think it is. Right now, our eyes are going at 18 times a second. And yet you see me as a steady person, I hope. And right now I see in the back of the room, I see people that are probably this big a visual angle versus somebody in the front row, which is this big. Well, I don't think those are pygmies back there and giants up here. All of that kind of correction is done for me by my nervous system. Consciousness has nothing to do with it, whatever, and can't even change it. These are the perceptual constancies, which shows just how much the nervous system does for us. Now, if I were to say something like, I want to show you the problems now, if I say, am I conscious of what I'm saying now? It's a little difficult, because if I become conscious of each word that I say, I couldn't speak at all. I am not taking my lexicon and selecting something from it and sticking it on this syntactical structure and then coming out with this speech. Instead, it's like having an intention that's never been fully described, and out comes this speech, for good or for ill. And it's the same thing with you listening. What does it mean for you to say, to be conscious of me speaking? I hope you are conscious of that intention and the meaning I am trying to get across, and perhaps a little less on the way I may be saying it. And so we can go on to other things of when we are not conscious, when we're typing or something of that kind. And I like to use the metaphor of a flashlight. If you ask a flashlight in a completely dark room to turn itself on and look around the room to see if there was any light in the room, wherever the flashlight looked, it would find that it was perfectly bright. And so it would come to the wrong answer that indeed this is a completely lit, brilliant room, when in fact it was not. It was almost the opposite. Now that's something like what we do with consciousness. When we think consciousness is in all our behavior, and it just isn't. There is so much that we do without consciousness at all. Another thing that consciousness is not is that it's not a copy of experience. And this goes back to Locke. And I won't go into that again, but it's like, I think Locke used the blank white paper, and the shades of Locke, I'm afraid, are perhaps getting a little angry at what I'm saying. But I think, Mr. Locke, that you would have used a camera, perhaps, to take pictures instead of a tabula rasa, and because that's sort of what we would use nowadays. And you can show in so many ways that consciousness doesn't do that at all. If I ask you what numbers go with what letters on a telephone, here's something you have seen how many times in your lives. And if somebody here has not been aware of this before, I'm sure you don't have the answer. It's just very certain. So you see, consciousness isn't picking up on everything that's happening. And supposing, here's another way to look at it. Supposing I ask you to think of the last time you were swimming. Okay, think of the last time you were swimming. Now, 80% of you, I can show it without even having a show of hands, because I've done this quite a few times, had a bird's eye view of yourself swimming, or else a pool's eye view of yourself swimming, something you have never seen in your life. And only if you're on a swimming team or it's your sport or something like that, did you have all the feeling of the temperature differentials, the breathing that was going on, the muscular kinds of things. It's an astonishing phenomenon. It's what we call an autoscopic image. And it shows that consciousness is not copying things. It is making up things of what things must have been and fitting them together in somewhat of a new pattern. So consciousness is not a copy of experience. And the third thing, I'm only going to 5 here, this is rather an academic beginning to my talk, is that consciousness is not necessary for learning. We study 3 kinds of learning in psychology. We have plain old Pavlovian conditioning, and you can show, we had a good psychologist named Razran here at Columbia who showed that, not the late Dr. Razran, who showed that consciousness can erase conditioning, let alone be necessary for it. And you can get conditioning in the hind leg of a cockroach. And anybody who wants to say that that is consciousness, I think is heading in the wrong direction. Another thing that we study is motor learning. Not so much now as we used to back in the 1920s when telegraphy was very important and typing, all these learning of the skills started to be studied very much by psychologists. And just to summarize a lot, it came out that people were astonished that indeed consciousness seemed to have little to do with it. Once someone got onto the problem, then it became sort of organic. Some of you have heard of some of the Zen practices, like Zen and the Art of Archery, or some of the things that even coaches might tell you, like the game of inner tennis. I've forgotten who the author is. All of these things are showing the same thing, that in the skills that we can learn, it is not consciousness that is fitting them together. It is something else, and consciousness, of course, can get us into this, can make us practice it, but that is not what is behind the learning of the skill. A third thing that we study in psychology, and study much more of, is, sorry if it makes such a noise when I blow my nose here. I have this microphone here that can be rather embarrassing at times. Is instrumental learning. Now, I'll just give you one example of that. That means learning solutions to a problem, or what Skinner calls operant conditioning. And in the Midwest, there was a psychology professor who gave a whole lecture on this learning without awareness, it was called. And he'd like to pace back and forth the way I am doing and like to do. And the class didn't quite believe this. So the next time, they thought they would really test this out. And so everybody, when he was on this side of his platform or stage, everybody would whisper and they wouldn't pay attention to him, wouldn't laugh at his jokes, and so on and so forth. And whenever he crossed the midline and was on this side, they'd pay rapt attention to him and applaud him and so on. Well, he kept going back and forth. Till finally, by the end of the lecture, he was practically over here and out the door without thinking that anything had happened to him, and he was extremely cross when he found out. But he should have been extremely happy that the students had learned their lessons so well. So consciousness is not necessary for learning. But how about now the fourth thing, thinking and reasoning? That sounds crazy. We sort of automatically think that consciousness is necessary. Of course, that's what consciousness is. But wait, it's not that simple. Back in 1901, there was a graduate student in Würzburg called Karl Marbe. And he did a fascinating experiment that I think was historically important, historically equal in psychology to the Michelson-Morley experiment in physics. But what a contrast. The Michelson-Morley experiment, I think as most of you know, was extremely complicated and sophisticated to do, even though the result was very simple, that there is no such thing as ether. But the Marbe experiment was so simple that people laugh at it now. They can't think of that as an experiment. All it was indeed a table with subjects would come in, and they had two weights that looked equal, but one was heavier than the other. They were simply to judge which is heavier and then introspect on how they got the answer. The point of the question is that Marbe was a graduate student. This is how they did things in those days. And all the subjects were senior professors. And all of them had to have been through 1,000 experiments in introspection before this experiment. And it was astonishing to them all that there was nothing in consciousness for that kind of judgment. Now it's hard to get that kind of feeling. You can try this yourself by taking two things that you know are unequal. But see if there's anything in consciousness for that particular judgment, which is certainly part of thought. And there isn't. And it started a whole school called the School of Imageless Thought, the Würzburg School, which I think is extremely important. They went on and studied this in many ramifications because nobody could quite believe it. It was very upsetting to a number of people. I'm going to use the blackboard here to give you another one, and I know perfectly well that people in the balcony and people in the back cannot see. So if you'll excuse us here in the first few rows and myself being an elite, we will now use the blackboard a little bit. I'll try to describe what I'm doing. So supposing I put this problem down on the board. And I ask you, what is the next geometric figure in this series? I have a circle, and a triangle, a circle, and a triangle, and a circle. And how do you get the answer? Introspect right here. This is like the Würzburg experiment. I suggest that you didn't do anything in consciousness to find that out. It just came like that. Just jumped out at you. And that's very, very like the Würzburg kind of experiment. Now, you may say, that's all right, that's such a simple kind of thing, but how about something more complicated? Well, I have a friend of mine, a late friend of mine, Paul Oppenheim in Princeton, who was one of Einstein's great, great friends. And Einstein would describe to him sometimes how in the morning he shaved in front of a mirror with one of these big old-fashioned razors. He never got out of that habit, big, horrible thing. And he had to be very careful, lest in the morning he cut himself, and suddenly he would get the solution to some equation he was trying to solve. This phenomenon I'm sure most of you have heard of. Henri Poincaré was another one who wrote extensively about this. In World War II, Wolfgang Köhler was told by physicists in England, we don't have the laboratory anymore. We have the 3 Bs, the bath, the bus, and the bed. That's where all ideas come from. They jump out at us when we are not expecting them. So that's what I mean by saying that consciousness is not really necessary for all kinds of thinking or reasoning. Of course it's necessary for complicated kinds of things where we have to get into them with our consciousness. And finally, something I almost wanted to skip, something about the location of consciousness. The reason I wanted to skip it is because a lot of people can make ideas that take deductions from this which are not true. If I ask you where your consciousness is, all of you probably will say, up in my head. And I'd like to suggest that there's no reason for that. There's nothing inside. We think of consciousness as space, a little space behind our eyes. And particularly if I look at somebody and make eye-to-eye contact with them up close here, I tend to think behind their eyes is a little space, and that you, as you're making eye contact with me, think behind my eyes is a little space, and magically the words are coming out, and so on. And ladies and gentlemen, inside our heads, there is nothing but physiological tissue. It happens to be neurological tissue that we call a brain, but there are no spaces in it like that at all. And that's something to think about. I'm saying it's a functional space. It's something we have created that we use. It is important, but it's not really there. And some of the more sophisticated behaviorists have made a huge, big point of this to try to explain that consciousness doesn't exist. But of course, I don't agree with that at all. That consciousness is fashioned by us in a functional kind of way. I always like to compare it to mathematics. If you remember back in learning geometry when you had to make projections with dotted lines in order to prove triangles congruent or something like that. Those were extremely important things to do, those projections. And this is something like the way I look at consciousness. Well, this is then what I wanted to say about a critique of how we look at consciousness. Now, remember what I have said, that it's not nearly as extensive as we used to think it was. It is not a copy of experience. It is not perception. It has no particular place. It is not necessary for learning, and it has no location, and it is not necessary for speaking or listening or understanding. I shouldn't have an allergy at this time of year if I'm going to use one of these, so excuse me again. But I'd like to pause here just to make you think of the idea that there could have been people, a race of people, who could think and could reason and could speak and could understand and could solve problems, but who were not conscious. That's the point of this first part of my talk, and I now turn to the second part. And what I'd like to do, begin the second part, is indeed to read you a little bit to get us over the hump of what consciousness is. Subjective conscious mind is an analog of what we call the real world. It is built up with the vocabulary or lexical field whose terms are all metaphors or analogs of behavior in the physical world. Its reality is of the same order as mathematics. It allows us to shortcut behavioral processes and arrive at more adequate decisions. Like mathematics, it is an operator rather than a thing or a repository, and it is intimately bound up with volition and decision. Consider the language we use to describe conscious processes. The most prominent group of words used to describe mental events are visual. We see solutions to problems, such as if you solve this problem, you would say, I see it is a triangle. Well, you don't really see it at all. That's simply an analog or metaphor of actual seeing. And so we have all these other words from seeing something from a viewpoint or grappling with its difficulties, and every word we use to refer to mental events is a metaphor of something in the behavioral world. And the adjectives that we use to describe physical behavior in real space are analogically taken over to describe mental behavior in mind space. We speak of the conscious mind as being quick or slow, of somebody being nimble-witted, strong-minded, weak-minded, broad, deep and open, or narrow-minded, and so on. Now that's just the beginnings of the kind of theory, and you can say, how indeed can you say this is metaphor and analogy, since these are just sort of figures of speech, as we called them back in grammar school. I'm not going to go into the whole theory of metaphor on which this is based, but metaphor is a much bigger thing than simply comparison between two things. It is the generation of new language, the generation of new kinds of meaning. If I use a common but beautiful metaphor, I think of such as saying the snow blankets the ground. Well, that's terribly simple, and it's simply trying to describe how the snow lies on the ground. But there are what I call parafires, or associations of using that word blanket, that are rather good. Instead of it being cold, it's warm. There is a birth coming. There is going to be a renewal coming spring. All of that is indeed in that using of that one word of blanket, with the idea of refreshing sleep and then waking up. That's just a tiny example of it, and one could go on much more seriously than that, and to show that indeed there are many principles that we can get out of that. Now, there are certain kinds of features, as I call them, of consciousness that I'd like just to describe three of them. One is that in consciousness, in this space right now that you feel is inside your minds as I ask you to be conscious, in that space we have a process called spatialization. And I don't mean anything more than what I've already described, that you think of it as a space. And in that space, if I ask you to think of time, it's a space. There isn't time there at all. You cannot think of time without making it into a space, or almost anything else. If I asked you, for example, when you were seeing yourself swimming, who did the looking? This is what we call the analog I, written this way. It's not E-Y-E. It's the analog I. And this is the same thing of Kant's, now the term has escaped me, yes, transcendental self. It's the same thing. It's this contentless essence that has to be there for all consciousness. And what does the analog I do in mind space? It narratizes. And that's just the simple kind of meaning that indeed it tells something over time, so that everything becomes a story, a narration. If I asked any of you right now to be conscious of yourself and tell me what you're thinking, you would say, well, I had dinner so-and-so, and then I came here, and afterwards I'm going to do this, and so on. All strung into this narrative a long time. That's all narratization means. And those are the three main features of consciousness. And I'm not going into some of the others, which is salience and recruitment and exerption and concentration and suppression, because they're not so important to this lecture. There are also kinds of modes of consciousness, but that takes quite a while to explain too. But of course, I think we all know the main mode of consciousness. I think it's verbal, at least with me it is. Constant dialogues going on, or monologues. And the second kind can be visual, where we are imagining what we're going to do next summer or something like that, or an activity. And there are other kinds of modes we can go into. But that's enough for now to give us an idea of consciousness in a different kind of key, to use Suzanne Langer's term there. Is that really what consciousness is? Yes, I think it is, and I think it's along those lines. An analog I narratizing in a mind space. Now to go back to the problem that we started off with. Where in evolution could that have started? Now, one of the big things to realize here is that what I've said is that consciousness is based on metaphor and analogy and language. There is no consciousness without language. Anybody who has a pet dog finds it awfully difficult to say that. Or anybody who's been studying the chimpanzees, can't say that. We have such empathy, such identification, that we want to see ourselves in animals and so on, with great sympathy and so on, which I think is a noble thing. But it isn't our kind of consciousness which is based on language. And that would mean if we wanted to solve the problem of the origin of language, well, let's go back in human history, because that's where it seems it might have happened. Now, for the elite up front, I have drawn some, this is a time chart here. What it says here, for those who can't read it, begins 200,000 BC. skips down to 10,000 BC, 3,000, 2,000 BC, and up to 2,000, which is what we're heading into. Where in all this could indeed consciousness have started? Well, one of the interesting things that happened right here in 3000 BC is the thing that we call writing. That is, taking the phonemes that compose our speech and putting it down in hieroglyphs or cuneiform on wet clay. And that is an extremely important event. I don't have to go on saying that, because then we have records that human beings are keeping, and we could go back and look at those early records and see, is there an analog I narratizing in a mind space, making the decisions? Now, those of you who know ancient languages know that hieroglyphics and cuneiform are extremely difficult. They've only recently been really deciphered, that when they are concrete, they are indeed probably very clear. But when they are not, they are still difficult to translate. And I think there's a great deal of similarity between that and Rorschach cards. I know of one experiment that Edmund Gordon, when he was a graduate student at the University of Pennsylvania, did. He had what was called a Sumerian proverb, so-called, probably shouldn't be called that, and he sent it around to all the cuneiform experts all over the world to see how they would translate it. Well, he got back some of a huge variety of answers. I mean, one answer would say simply, this is simply a matter about fertility in the fields, and it's interesting from the point of view of agriculture. And another person wrote back and said, this is indeed the strongest evidence I have seen for rampant homosexuality in the Sumerian world. Well, with such differences as that, when we go through something like mental words, it's pretty hard to be certain of what we're doing. So we should go back to a language which we have some kind of continuity with and criticism of. And I'd like to suggest that that is Greek when we look for a long kind of passage. Of course, we could look at Hebrew, but we would have to go somewhat later in Hebrew, because in Greek we can go back to the Iliad. The Iliad, there's lots of debate about the Iliad and what its date is, but it is the story of the Trojan War that happened in 1235 BC, and it became changed as it went on through the various kind of aerodoi and rhapsodies until it became written down perhaps around 800 BC. And Homer may have been the rhapsody who first wrote it down, or maybe he never existed at all. But I think the idea that Homer wrote the Iliad in his youth and the Odyssey in his old age is simply nonsense. It is oral poetry, and I think it's a very important thing to realize. Now, if we look at the Iliad, and perhaps I should say the older parts of the Iliad, because there are incursions that come in from modern times. We know that a lot of incursions around the time of Pindar in 500 BC, and some from later times. But if we look at the older parts of the Iliad and ask, are people deciding things with an analog I, narratizing in a mind space? And if you ask that question of what Achilles is deciding, or Hector, or Agamemnon, I think you come to the conclusion that no, they are not deciding things with consciousness. And then how is anything decided? What happens? Someone goes along, and then there's a problem to be solved. Whether to continue the Trojan War or not, or whatever. And in comes a voice called a god, telling the person what to do. Now that voice, called a god, I think is an auditory, verbal hallucination, similar to those that Joan of Arc had, similar to those that Emanuel Swedenborg, remarkable man, if you know of him, or William Blake had, similar to some extent, those which modern schizophrenics had, similar to what some of you have heard. Because in an audience this size, there is a certain percentage of you who have heard auditory hallucinations and probably didn't dare tell anybody about them, because You have always been brought up in the idea that that means you're crazy. It doesn't. That's just one of the DSM-3 signs of it. And it doesn't necessarily mean that. Lots of normal people have auditory hallucinations. But it is, a very disturbed person who can't get his life together and can't work out things, yes, then it is diagnostic of schizophrenia. But I'm suggesting that this goes way back in history, and here we have it in the Iliad, all through the Iliad. And what's more, all of the other literature at this time, that people, when there was that stress of solving a problem, stress cued it off physiologically from somewhere in the brain, there was an auditory hallucination that told the person what to do. This is what we're calling the bicameral mind. It is just a bad metaphor on a bicameral legislature, and it's not a very good one. I don't think the Senate and the House of Representatives are very good as matching up to this, but it does mean that there was an upper house of the God side and a lower house of the human being side, and the God side decided everything, and this was volition back at that time. And it's a very simple kind of thing in which a person was told what to do. Now, of course, you can say, it's impossible. Everybody would be hearing all kinds of different things. And that is not true, because what you have are the expectancies built up. And I'm suggesting that somewhere in the brain, there is an area that is processing all admonitory information, by which I mean everything your parents have told you, your visitors have told you, your kings and everybody else, and priests, what is expected, and that is processed in some part of the brain. Yes, I'm pointing to my right hemisphere. I'm going to be saying that, as some of you know. And that is where the auditory hallucination originates from. Now, that's a hypothesis that you want to start with and then see, does this work out? Well, we want to go to other civilizations, going away from Greece, and see if there is any truth to this. Let me just mention Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia had these big city-states in which the ruler was the owner of the land, and it was a wooden statue. And the wooden statue lived in a gaginu, lived in quotes, and a gaginu was a big room at the base of the old type of ziggurat. And everything was done with elaborate ceremony, all kinds of ritual for these idols, gods, they were called. They weren't statues of gods, they were gods. And we have literature that says, indeed, people approached these statues and heard these hallucinations coming from them. Lots of them doing that. This is in Mesopotamia. And everybody had his own individual god there, called his Ili, I-L-I. Note how close that is to the Hebrew Eli. And it was a situation in which you have human beings in a hierarchy and gods in a hierarchy, each person with his personal god, then there are gods above that, and so on. A whole pyramid like a house of cards. And indeed, if it gets jostled enough, it breaks down, as I'm going to mention in a moment. And then if we go over to Egypt, it's slightly different and not quite as interesting. It is where indeed you have a different kind of situation where the Pharaoh himself is the god and becomes Osiris on death. This is quite different from Mesopotamia. It's interesting that these two neighboring countries almost have such different kind of types of bicameral kingdoms. Of these, they weren't kingdoms, they were theocracies, because the head of them always was a god, not a human being. And in Egypt, the personal god is not the Ili, the personal god is a Ka, the K-A. And everybody has his own Ka, they all in a hierarchy again, leading up indeed to the Pharaoh himself. And it is all very intricately, and it can be worked out very intricately with the theory of the bicameral mind, so that we can understand for the first time this strange stuff about the about the emperor becoming with his Ka, Osiris, after he dies, and that's the person that is heard next by the next in line, and so on. Now, that's in those huge places back then, big cradle of civilization in the Near East. Civilization begins in various places in the Near East and then spreads throughout Mesopotamia into Anatolia, then into Egypt, then into, indeed, southern Russia and into India, then into Thailand, and then into China, and then, indeed, independently begins. I should have also said that it goes south into Africa with the Nak, which is a bicameral civilization, and then civilization begins perhaps independently, perhaps not, in the whole series of civilizations leading up to the Aztec in Mesoamerica, and then perhaps independently, but we don't really know, in the series of civilizations leading up to the Inca in the Andean highlands. And wherever we look, in all of those, we find some evidence of the bicameral mind. We find idols, or where we have any kind of literature. They're talking about gods all the time. Or where we have an interface between, let's say, something like the Spaniards and the Incas coming together. The Spaniards, the priests, would write back to Spain about how all these people heard the voice of the devil speaking to them from their idols in the temples. So this kind of evidence seems to be very important, and I was very worried when I first learned about the ubiquity of idols and how strange they are for us to understand. And then I realized that in the Iliad, where the idea had come from, there are no idols at all. So I was in Greece at the time, and I went to see Professor Sakalarakis, who's the curator at the Museum of Antiquities that I'm sure some of you have visited. And he said, yes, that is strange. Because when we excavate a temple coming directly from that period, we find it knee-deep in broken idols. So there is a place where indeed all the idolatry has been suppressed somehow and for some reason. I mean, anybody can speculate on that. But that is the bicameral civilization, and I think it started in the Near East, and I think it came out of a new kind of social organization so that human beings could move from a tribal people to a civilized people, by which I mean not anything good or bad, but living in great big societies where everybody didn't know everybody else. That's simple. And you find that indeed among tribal peoples, everybody has to know everybody else, to know their place in the hierarchy. And it's the same thing in other primates like chimpanzees, but particularly gorillas. And then we can move to these cities when we have this new kind of arrangement of the bicameral mind with all these gods and hierarchies, and perhaps later on priests to sort out these particular things, and it gets fairly complex. Now, here I have 200,000 to 10,000 BC, and this is indeed what I'm not sure. I used to call it Neanderthal, but ideas of Neanderthal are changing now. What happens? Someone goes along, and then there's a problem to be solved. Whether to continue the Trojan War or not, or whatever. And in comes a voice called a god, telling the person what to do. Now that voice, called a god, I think is an auditory, verbal hallucination, similar to those that Joan of Arc had, similar to those that Emanuel Swedenborg, a remarkable man, if you know of him, or William Blake had, similar to some extent, those which modern schizophrenics had, similar to what some of you have heard. Because in an audience this size, there is a certain percentage of you who have heard auditory hallucinations and probably didn't dare tell anybody about them because you have always been brought up in the idea that that means you're crazy. It doesn't. That's just one of the DSM-3 signs of it. And it doesn't necessarily mean that. Lots of normal people have auditory hallucinations. But it is, a very disturbed person who can't get his life together and can't work out things, yes, then it is diagnostic of schizophrenia. But I'm suggesting that this goes way back in history, and here we have it in the Iliad, all through the Iliad. And what's more, all of the other literature at this time, that people, when there was that stress of solving a problem, stress cued it off physiologically from somewhere in the brain, there was an auditory hallucination that told the person what to do. This is what we're calling the bicameral mind. It is just a bad metaphor on a bicameral legislature, and it's not a very good one. I don't think the Senate and the House of Representatives are very good as matching up to this, but it does mean that there was an upper house. Human beings. God's side decided everything, and this was volition back at that time. And it's a very simple kind of thing in which a person was told what to do. Now, of course, you can say, it's impossible. Everybody would be hearing all kinds of different things. And that is not true, because what you have are the expectancies built up. And I'm suggesting that somewhere in the brain, there is an area that is processing all admonitory information, by which I mean everything your parents have told you, your visitors have told you, your kings and everybody else, and priests, what is expected, and that is processed in some part of the brain. Yes, I'm pointing to my right hemisphere. I'm going to be saying that, as some of you know. And that is where the auditory hallucination originates from. Now, that's a hypothesis that you want to start with and then see, does this work out? Well, we want to go to other civilizations, going away from Greece, and see if there is any truth to this. Let me just mention Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia had these big city-states in which the ruler was the owner of the land, and it was a wooden statue. And the wooden statue lived in a gaginu, lived in quotes, and a gaginu was a big room at the base of the old type of ziggurat. And everything was done with elaborate ceremony, all kinds of ritual for these idols, gods, they were called. They weren't statues of gods, they were gods. And we have literature that says, indeed, people approached these statues and heard these hallucinations coming from them. Lots of them doing that. This is in Mesopotamia. And everybody had his own individual god there, called his Ili, I-L-I. Note how close that is to the Hebrew Eli. And it was a situation in which you have human beings in a hierarchy and gods in a hierarchy, each person with his personal god, then there are gods above that, and so on. A whole pyramid, like a house of cards, that indeed, if it gets jostled enough, it breaks down, as I'm going to mention in a moment. And then if we go over to Egypt, it's slightly different and not quite as interesting. It is where indeed you have a different kind of situation where the Pharaoh himself is the god and becomes Osiris on death. This is quite different from Mesopotamia. It's interesting that these two neighboring countries almost have such different kind of types of bicameral kingdoms. Of these, they weren't kingdoms, they were theocracies, because the head of them always was a god, not a human being. And in Egypt, the personal god is not the Ili, the personal god is a Ka, the K-A. And everybody has his own Ka, they all in a hierarchy again, leading up indeed to the Pharaoh himself. And it is all very intricately, and can be worked out very intricately with the theory of the bicameral mind, so that we can understand for the first time this strange stuff about the emperor becoming with his Ka, Osiris, after he dies, and that's the person that is heard next by the next in line, and so on. Now, that's in those huge places back then, big cradle of civilization in the Near East. Civilization begins in various places in the Near East and then spreads throughout Mesopotamia, into Anatolia, then into Egypt, then into, indeed, southern Russia, and into India, then into Thailand, and then into China, and then, indeed, independently begins, I should have also said that it goes south into Africa with the Nak, which is a bicameral civilization, and then civilization begins perhaps independently, perhaps not, in the whole series of civilizations leading up to the Aztec in Mesoamerica, and then perhaps independently, but we don't really know, in the series of civilizations leading up to the Inca in the Andean highlands. And wherever we look, in all of those, we find some evidence of the bicameral mind. We find idols, or where we have any kind of literature. They're talking about gods all the time. Or where we have an interface between, let's say, something like the Spaniards and the Incas coming together. The Spaniards, the priests, would write back to Spain about how all these people heard the voice of the devil speaking to them from their idols in the temples. So this kind of evidence seems to be very important, and I was very worried when I first learned about the ubiquity of idols and how strange they are for us to understand. And then I realized that in the Iliad, where the idea had come from, there are no idols at all. So I was in Greece at the time, and I went to see Professor Sakalarakis, who's the curator at the Museum of Antiquities that I'm sure some of you have visited. And he said, yes, that is strange. Because when we excavate a temple coming directly from that period, we find it knee-deep in broken idols. So there is a place where indeed all the idolatry has been suppressed somehow and for some reason. I mean, anybody can speculate on that. But that is the bicameral civilization, and I think it started in the Near East, and I think it came out of a new kind of social organization so that human beings could move from a tribal people to a civilized people, by which I mean not anything good or bad, but living in great big societies where everybody didn't know everybody else. That's simple. And you find that indeed among tribal peoples, everybody has to know everybody else, to know their place in the hierarchy. And it's the same thing in other primates like chimpanzees, but particularly gorillas. And then we can move to these cities when we have this new kind of arrangement of the bicameral mind with all these gods and hierarchies, and perhaps later on priests to sort out these particular things, and it gets fairly complex. Now, here I have 200,000 to 10,000 BC, and this is indeed what I'm not sure. I used to call it Neanderthal, but ideas of Neanderthal are changing now. But it's when human beings were going around in a tribal situation, or bands as we should call them, and language was evolving. And language finished evolving somewhere around 10,000 BC, and I think hearing hallucinations was just an adjunct of that, and developed right along this time. And then we go to big civilizations that just jump into the historical record here, 9,000 BC. And then we have these huge bicameral kingdoms in which there is evidence for hearing voices, hearing auditory hallucinations through them all. And then things get too complicated, somewhere around 1400 BC. Now, this is the breakdown of the bicameral mind. It's most clearly seen in Assyria. Around 1400 BC, there is this vicious tyrant called Tukulti-Ninurta I. In the East Berlin Museum, you can find an altar about this size from here down, and on the front of it is carved a picture of Tukulti-Ninurta pointing and then kneeling in front of what is an empty throne. And that kind of scene has never been shown before. At least I've searched for one and can't find it. And so this, I think, is heralding the breakdown of the bicameral mind. You find this in the literature. You find it in the great piece of literature called Ludlu Belnequi. The first 3 lines of the damaged first tablet read something like, "Where is the God that used to tell me what to do? Where is the goddess that used to lead me by the hand? What have I done that the gods and goddesses no longer speak to me? Which is simply a description of this. And I'd like to bring up to you the echo there is in the great Hebrew Psalms. Like Psalm 42, as the heart pants after the water brooks, so pants my mind, it should be, after you, O Elohim, plural. That beautiful, beautiful psalm seems to have back here a beginning in this other kind of cuneiform literature as well. This is the breakdown in Assyria, and we find other things, examples here. We find the introduction of the idea of heaven, which hasn't been there before, because that's where the gods have gone, with Anu in the sky, as Gilgamesh epic says. And we find the institution of real prayer, as I've just mentioned with Dekolti. We find the beginning of demons and evil gods, because gods that won't speak to you, just like people who refuse to speak to you, they must mean harm for you. So in 1000 BC, the people in Babylon were going around the city draped in amulets and all these charms saying, protect me from Pazazu, the wind demon, and all that kind of thing. And at the same time, we had the development of a new kind of making decisions. And this is divination. And there's been occasional divination before this time, but only occasional. And now it really rises to the surface. There are all kinds of simple things like oil on water, which is one way in the Hebrew Testament that we find Jacob divining. But there are other simple things like throwing lots, which we also find in the Bible. We have throwing of dice and many, many other kinds of simple divination like this. But the two most important and serious ones are first expistacy, which is this rather ugly thing where you priest says prayers into a lamb or a goat, which is then sacrificed, and he's cut open, and particularly his liver becomes very important, because that shows, remember, they're trying to get at the messages of the gods. What is it that the gods intend for us? Because they are silent, they must speak to us through these signs, and this would reveal what the gods intended for us. And then the final method of divination, which is with us still, and this is astrology. And it's interesting that we still have this, particularly in our newspapers. And it's interesting, too, that even a skeptic such as myself, when he comes to Pisces, will tend to look at it and why? Because I'm so unsure of what my life is going to be. Let me tell you that the unsureness of life back at this time, when you had the certainty of God's telling you what to do and who you were, and suddenly that was taken away. And it's in that agony that consciousness develops on the basis of metaphor. We can't see this clearly in the cuneiform literature, at least I can't. But when we go over to Greece, there we can find this wonderfully written record. Begin with the two Homeric poems, begin with the Iliad and going to the Odyssey, and then through Hesiod, to the lyric and elegiac poets of the next 2 centuries, and then up into including people like Sappho, talking about the internality of love, and Alcaeus, and a number of very, very interesting poets that most people haven't heard of, and then ending up with, in 600 BC, with Solon. And Solon is the first person to talk about mind the way you and I do. And it sort of jumps into place there. He uses the word nous, N-O-U-S, as much as almost any other word, far more than anybody else. And he's the person that says, know thyself, although that's given to the Delphic oracle by some people. But how can you know yourself unless you have an analog I narratizing in a mind space and can go back over spatialized time to try to figure out who you are and what you are trying to do and going to do. That is indeed the story of the coming of consciousness that in Greece, and I could spend a lot more time on this. It's only briefly covering this. I find that when I said that the bicameral mind broke down, I should have said a little bit more about some of the causes of this breakdown, that indeed one of them was the advent of writing itself, that took away the auditory power of the bicameral mind. Once things could be written, as in Hammurabi's hegemony, as he tried to run it with what we would regard as memos, although they were clay tablets, we have a lot of them, it stretches things out, and it doesn't have the power that the auditory hallucinations did. With auditory hallucinations, you cannot get away from them. They are just there. Now, the third place we can look and see the coming of consciousness and the breakdown of the bicameral mind is indeed something that's much closer to us all. And this is indeed what we can get at by calling it among the refugees of some of the terrible things that happened at this time. Just about 1400 BC, there was this huge eruption of the island of Thera that you can still see. I saw it just a couple of years ago. This huge, it's 20 miles wide anyway, crater. And this caused a tsunami and a whole bunch of the land to fall down below the surface of the sea. It's the origin of the tale of Atlantis, as is told in Plato. And this caused a game of musical chairs, of one kingdom moving in on another. We have invasions all over the place. In Greece, it's the Dorian invasions. In Egypt, it's the invasions of the people from the sea. And then there are descriptions in cuneiform tablets of people screaming down through the Lebanon, and all this dispute over lands. And then we come to what is the various derivations of this word. I was following a person who would say it really meant refugee, and it's in the language of Akkad, and the word is Habiru, which then becomes our word Hebrew. And the story of the Hebrews, or one branch of the Hebrews, is what is told in our Hebrew Testament. Now, any of you who know what was called the higher biblical criticism in Germany at the last part of the last century will know that it's pretty hard to look for historical proof of any kind, because it seems to be woven together from many different sources. Like the first two chapters of Genesis tell different creation stories, although I know that there are ways of saying that it is not quite like that. I've talked to rabbis about this, and there is plenty of room for disagreement. And there are other things that show such disagreement within the Hebrew Testament that how can we look at that for evidence? Well, there are the pure books that are usually by one author, and that we know that very well. That is short books, and I wish you would look at them. And I'm trying to be very cold and scientific here, but I certainly don't want to be sacrilegious to anybody's beliefs. If we take the oldest, which is the book of Amos, and the date is clearly 800 BC, and compare it with the most recent, which is the book of Koheleth, or Ecclesiastes, which is 200 BC, we should try to get some kind of comparison, perhaps, between something closer to the bicameral mind and something closer to consciousness. Well, let me just tell you that indeed, if you look at Amos, he is not a wise old man, I don't think. I suggest he was a shepherd boy, 16 or 17 years old, who has been full of the Hebrew history all his life, out in the fields, watching the stars and so on. And when he says in some of the translations, "Thus saith the Lord," and out comes this marvelous kind of speech with such authenticity that indeed he has scribes gathered around him and copied this down. This doesn't come from him, it indeed comes from Yahweh. And that is very, very close to the bicameral mind, except it is much more powerful, much more vivid and much more historical, much more about a whole people, not about an individual. When we go to Koheleth or Ecclesiastes, there we have something very, very different, in which, if you remember the great hymn to time, that is the second chapter of Ecclesiastes, there is a time for love and a time for war, a time for planting, a time for harvest. It's been too overused, but it's a beautiful kind of conscious spatializing out of time. And in the very first chapter, he says, in my heart, I see, this use of the word see, I see that wisdom excelleth folly, full of profound metaphors and profound meanings of this kind. I think you can see that indeed there is this comparison, and it works out a little bit here between the comparison of indeed Koheleth and Amos. Now you can make other kinds of analyses. You can go through in the story itself, when indeed Moses is told, otherwise Deuteronomy says that Moses is the last person to see God face to face and talk to him as man to man, and how then God is only heard by the prophets, or perhaps seen by Ezekiel, and then the age of prophecy dies away. We have the books of wisdom. The whole long, majestic story is the story of the fading away of God's voice and the coming of wisdom. Now, I'm trying to say you can have other constructions on that. That is just in the text. And it's a very moving kind of story, which of course was the great contribution to world history. Now that's all the story I'm going to tell about the coming of consciousness in the breakdown of the bicameral mind. Here we are doing other studies. We're doing studies in China now, which by Michael Carr, one of my colleagues, which shows indeed that if you take the Xi Qing and analyze it properly, you can divide it into 4 parts, and you can show the increase of consciousness words in that. Astonishingly, it's at the same particular period of history as the Hebrew Bible and as the Greek literature. And of course, we want to do it for India, but it's very, very difficult to do that because the data don't go back that far. Now, I heard in Dr. Rubin's introduction that indeed this was to touch on something about the brain and its relationship to consciousness. On that subject, I can't say a thing at all. But I can say something about what I regard as a relationship of the brain to the bicameral mind. Here is the left hemisphere, and I think most of you know that here in Broca's area, right here at the back of the frontal lobe, is the main area for articulation, and this is the area, Wernicke's area, the main area for meaning and significance. And these 2 areas are what right now in me, on my left hemisphere, are doing most of the work. Now, if we go over to the other side, what happens in the Wernicke's area? Now, I've puzzled about that for so long, and then of course it hit me just as it would any child, because I don't think this is very profound. Could it be that it was the right hemisphere, what corresponds to Wernicke's area, the posterior part of the right temporal lobe, in right-handed people, and in most left-handed people too, that indeed was that area that processed all admonitory information, so that under a little bit of stress of making decision, it sent a voice over probably the anterior commissures, which connect that part of the brain. And that is what an auditory hallucination is. If you look down in the brain like this, and I'm sorry for those people who still can't see it, you have 2 hemispheres, the left and the right, and you have particularly the anterior commissures. How can you get all this information that is processed in the right hemisphere over to the other side? You have to put it into some kind of code, and there's no more majestic and wonderful code in the entire universe that we know of than human language. And that is what an auditory hallucination is. And I'm suggesting that it's the right hemisphere that is processing all admonitory information. And we can make tests of right hemispheric function and show that indeed that hemisphere would be what has the capacities of synthesis and fitting things together that would be required of these bicameral voices that created the very first civilizations that we that we can see. Now, to close up, I'm just going to say that when I first came on this idea, I have some neurosurgeons who are friends of mine, and I was wondering, would they open up a bone flap here on my right side? And I was a little scared, but I thought, oh, I'm a scientist, I'll get to face up to this. And stimulate the posterior part of the temporal lobe here. And would I hear the voices of the gods again? That was the question. Well, I was very relieved when I suddenly realized Wilder Penfield had done this all before, and so I didn't have to go through it. And he did this as part of his surgery, where he was going to take out good parts of the right temporal lobe because of temporal lobe epilepsy. And that doesn't disturb this data that he found, but he would stimulate around the posterior part of the right temporal lobe to make sure that this wasn't the language hemisphere. Because when you do that in the language hemisphere, the person can't speak at all. And it's just a slight little electric current, like at the end of a paintbrush, a watercolor brush. And when he did this, here is the kind of data he got. One patient, they were all conscious and awake. One patient said, that voice, I lost touch with reality when stimulated right here. Another patient said, a voice saying words, but it's so faint that I could not get it. And a housewife said, someone talking, that man's voice, my father frightens me a lot. And Dr. Penfield went on questioning her about her father because he wanted to think there's a bank of memories. But no, she said, no, that isn't my father. I don't know why I said that. Another patient just heard the voice saying, sit still, sit still, sit still. And another 14-year-old boy, and see if this sounds like a memory, saw two men in armchairs singing at him, which is very strange, right there in the operating room. Another patient said, there they go yelling at me, doctor, stop them, and the voices lasted 21 seconds from just a little stimulation there. Well, that shows that there may be the remnants of the bicameral mind here, that maybe we can experiment with, let's say, schizophrenic patients who are hallucinating and find indeed that it is indeed the right hemisphere and the right temporal lobe where most of this is going on. But regardless of that, this is the bicameral mind, and I think the evidence of it in texts is very, very strong. And if we had one lesson to remember from all this, it is that it means that we are conscious and have been conscious only the last 3,000 years. And before that, we're not. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is only 100 generations. And I think that this consciousness that makes us really what we mean by human is only 100 generations old. I think we can conclude from that we are all still very young. Thank you very much.